I appreciate that you made very clear last time you're an Aranda man, you don't speak for the Warlpiri people and you don't purport to speak for the Luritja people. So I want to ask you some questions. Please let me know if I'm asking you anything inappropriate. In the community, we spent Monday and Tuesday in Yuendamu, and we were very grateful for the welcome from the community and the opportunity to meet community members. In the community, there were strong messages that we heard about the community's hurt and frustration if Cardia misinterpret what payback means. That often that's portrayed in a way that is not the proper understanding of payback. Are you able to say, as an Aranda man, what your understanding of payback is? That is, the benefits of payback.
Just a caveat for that, I can only talk for my understanding and the traditional knowledge that I've been able to gain through my lifetime. I don't talk for Warlpiri people, Pindabi people, Luritja people, and I'm not a leader within my own tribal group. I'm still learning about my own culture. I think there's a great misinterpretation across the Northern Territory when it comes to the concept of payback. I think the concept of payback is interpreted more from a contemporary westernised side as being revenge or punishment. I think from my understanding and the knowledge that I've gained in my life, it's based more around peacemaking and bringing balance back to the community.
Have you had, obviously not going to ask you for any names, have you had an experience within your own Aranda people of family or community members going through payback and it having that effect of restoration?
Yes, I have. I've seen the process carried out in my youth. Prior to, I think it was 1999, there was a general order for NT police in relation to payback. That's since been rescinded. However, I think it was 1995, I had a family member who'd committed an offence that was, from memory, and I was quite young at the time, released by the court and travelled back to the community, and the process was carried out to perform payback. But as I said, it was a process of peacemaking between two clan groups, and it stopped the situation from further developing as an altercation between our two family and clan groups, tribal groups.
We were asked to listen when we were in community to the community's frustration and what, if you'll accept from me, I heard as hurt, that the Cardia legal system doesn't allow for proper recognition of customary law. Do you have any comment about that as an Aranda man?
In Australia, from my understanding and from my observations during my lifetime, there's very little recognition from Westminster's system of governance and law for tribal law and customary law within the country. I've worked overseas, particularly in the Solomon Islands, where I saw customary law embedded into the legal system of that country. And I understand from my experience working with New Zealand police and from working with New Zealand police here in the Northern Territory and conversations I've had with them, that there is a greater recognition for First Nations law and cultural authority than we have in this country.
The challenge, if I might say, is what we heard about in the community also is that payback would involve spearing. And in this case, where the community are aggrieved understandably by Kumanjayi's death and that Constable Rolfe caused the death, this court can't condone grievous bodily harm to be committed against a constable who was involved in that situation. I'm wondering if there is a way that you can talk to about how to accommodate customary law outside of that practice.
I think that's a conversation for the court to have with the Warlpiri elders. I don't think it would be appropriate for me to comment on that as a non-Warlpiri person, but if it was my family group that was involved, I think that they would want to mediate the situation in relation to what's occurred and moving forward to address that.
If it was an Aranda community and say your family group involved, Senior Counsellor, if I can just ask you to think about that hypothetical, would it be meaningful in Aranda law for, say, the Commissioner of Police to meet at the end of this inquest, to meet with your community and family group and talk through what justice might look like, what other concepts of justice might look like, what the learning for the police is, for example?
That would be beneficial, but I think it's an issue that's bigger than the police. I think it's an issue for the Australian government to address.
Elsewhere in New South Wales, outside of the Northern Territory, embedded within the Cardia legal system are things like circle sentencing. In the district court level in New South Wales, they have just started a process of the Wallamar Court where Aboriginal elders are involved with district court judges in sentencing for Aboriginal offenders. Do you think that process of empowering elders to be involved in the sentencing process should come in the Northern Territory?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The Northern Territory is unique in a way, but I think that we're a little behind the eight ball in the uptake in relation to what's happened with some of the courts interstate. So I know the circle sentencing in New South Wales has been well received by the community, and I think there's been some great community benefits to come out of that. I don't think that the contemporary westernised system of punishment through sentencing the way that it's done here is always successful. And I think that's shown by the recidivism rate that we have in our community. So in a simple way of putting it, I think if we keep doing the same thing and we're not coming to a different outcome, then perhaps we need to think outside the box.
The Wallamar Court at the district court level is a very new concept for New South Wales. We don't have a district court in the Northern Territory. We've got a Supreme Court. Can you foresee the benefit of having elders from the community group where the person being sentenced comes from assisting a Supreme Court judge with that sentencing process?
Yeah, I think that would be beneficial to address some of the grievances in the community and possibly start that process of recognition of Aboriginal law into the mainstream. In Australia, we tend to say that we've got one system of law and that all people are governed by the one system of law, but there's been multiple systems of law in force in this country for thousands of years, and there's very little recognition of that. As a police officer, I enforce the legislation that I've got in front of me, but nowhere in our legislation is there any recognition of the First Nations people and their systems of governance that have assisted to drive their communities and their clan groups and their family groups over that period of time. And now we're seeing a breakdown in our communities and our family groups. And we've got multi-layered government approach to all of those problems, but all the solutions are coming from one side of the house.
You have been a police officer now through the 90s and through the 2000s. Did you see a shift in your career in terms of the recognition and respect for traditional systems of justice?
Wouldn't say that there's been a shift. I would say that the attitudes of I can't talk for Northern Territory Police. I was Special Constable of Northern Territory Police from 2011 to 2020, and I've been a member of Northern Territory Police as a constable for the past 2 years. So what I have seen over that period of time since 1998 is definitely a shift in attitude, but I think it's a shift in attitude that represents society, not necessarily the police, because police do represent society. So in the 90s, the world was a different place to what it is in 2022, and what was acceptable then isn't as acceptable, or it's not acceptable now.
Yes.
So yes, I've seen a change, but I don't think it is unique to the police. I think it's a society change, and the police have represented that change in society.
Yes. Is it fair to say that in the 1990s, you were aware of circumstances where customary law, including payback, would be accommodated by the Cardia legal system?
Yes, that was before I was involved in policing though, so my understanding of that was limited to my interactions within my own tribes and my own family group. But it may be beneficial for the court to talk to a long-serving Northern Territory police officer who has experience in remote and regional areas that would have experienced that in the past to where it is now, because they would actually be able to speak to that with some authority more than I can.
The changes, so we're different levels of regulation and acceptance in 2022, but that's imposed on Aboriginal communities without consultation. And does that have an effect of disempowering elders and breaking down traditional structures?
Even within my own families, my own communities, we've seen a disempowerment of our system of governance definitely in the past 10 to 15 years. And I think that's been driven by somewhat the introduction of the intervention in the Northern Territory. I won't say that everything that happened there has been negative, but there's definitely been some negative side effects of that process.
Are you able to expand on that at all? Give an example of how that works?
I think in the past we were all about engagement and empowerment, and it was about giving the communities autonomy and self-autonomy to govern with the introduction of the super shires. There's been a decrease in jobs in communities, a decrease for local opportunities in communities. It's something that family talks about quite a lot. So, you know, I've seen a lot of urban drift. A lot of family members that traditionally stayed in communities and were really proud of their communities. More and more people are moving into town. There seems to be less focus or less capability for people to drive their lives forward staying in the bush. So it's changed a lot.
In terms of the changes that are negative, you were asked some questions on the last occasion about the numbers of Aboriginal of people in custody, and I think the statistic that was put to you last time was something like 96% of all people in custody in the Northern Territory are Aboriginal. Do you have a sense as a Northern Territory police officer about whether or not Aboriginal people are targeted by police, or whether or not there are other more complex reasons for those high numbers?
I don't see Aboriginal people being targeted by the police at all. What I see is Northern Territory police officers responding to the calls for assistance and help that are placed through the JESC, so the Joint Emergency Services Communications Centre in Darwin. So police, traditionally, we respond to requests from the community for assistance. So I don't see members driving around looking for an Aboriginal person to lock up, but the bulk of our calls for assistance are coming from one cross-section of the community, and that's partially my cross-section of the community. So what I see is a greater social issue, not necessarily a policing issue.
In terms of the greater social issue, this is a big question. You've talked about some of the possible causes of that in terms of the breakdown in authority structures in community and the urban drift in. Are there any other underlying causes that you wanted to talk about?
Oh, that's a very big question, and I think we could discuss and debate that for an extended period of time, but I think we are where we are now because there's been, at some level, a multifaceted, multi-layered failure from government and from non-government organisations in relation to Aboriginal affairs in the Northern Territory. Well, not just the Northern Territory, but Australia. We've certainly, in some areas, we've moved forward, and in some areas we've stalled and gone backwards. So it's very difficult.
Nowhere in our legislation is there a recognition of First Nations people. Do you feel that that would make a difference?
Well, we're the only contemporary westernised society in the world that has a First Nations population that doesn't have some recognition in place. So that in itself speaks volumes about where we are in Australia at this point in time.
In terms of the multifaceted, multi-layered failures that get us to some of the traumas that exist in community now, do you have a sense of, you did that time in general duties, do you have a sense of frustration about the lack of other options for people on the street who are coming into contact with police other than being picked up?
Well, I think that the police are ultimately responsible for a lot more social order and justice issues than they should be. I think that the police are the stopgap where there's not another option to utilise at a given point in time to deal with a situation. So as a police officer, we're expected to, our role is to enforce legislation. It's not to punish people, it's to bring people before the courts. However, we find ourselves being part psychologist, part social worker, first aider, parent. So there's a lot more that goes into wearing this uniform day to day than what a lot of people realise, and a lot more stress and a lot more commitment.
If police were working alongside, we talked last time about the role of territory families and the difficulty of them not being available overnight, for example, with the young people to help police in a difficult situation. Other supports that would help police, for example, psychologists. Are you thinking about other mechanisms?
Well, there's funded government responses in place to provide all of those services, but whether they're available, whether the funding is enough to have people on call on a 24/7 basis. But the biggest issue that we've got is we police remote. So policing remote in the Northern Territory is unique, and most of the time there is no services available other than what you can provide as a member of this organisation, Northern Territory Police. So you may have an on-call nurse at the clinic, and the clinic nurses in our remote communities are amazing. They do a fantastic job. But as police in remote communities, you respond to everything within that community. And there may be two of you, there may be three in a smaller community. In our larger communities, there may be more, but it's a huge task that's been given. And those officers that work in those remote locations don't have the supports that exist in Alice Springs and Darwin in particular, and then Tennant Creek and Katherine as smaller regional centres.
Does that come back full circle to what you earlier talked about the lack of employment opportunities for Aboriginal people in communities, that empowering Aboriginal people to provide supports for their own community would go a long way to helping police in that role?
Well, it's my opinion and my opinion only, but the biggest benefit to my family and my community would be self-empowerment and development within their own sphere of influence and where they culturally live and should be. If those opportunities don't exist and people don't have a reason to wake up in the morning, then it changes the tone of life. I think that's a fact for anybody, whether you're cardio or yappa.
Before I move on from the idea of I would put to you the statistics of people in prison, do you have a sense of frustration about the lack of availability for rehab options for Aboriginal people once they go into custody?
Look, I have an Aboriginal mother and a non-Aboriginal father. The way that my mother looks at the world is totally different to the way that my father looks at the world. The way that my mother looks at a piece of land is totally different to the way my father looks at a piece of land. My mother and father have been together for 50 odd years, so they became a partnership when it wasn't okay for a non-Aboriginal man to be with an Aboriginal woman. You know, it wasn't accepted by society, and they faced those issues throughout their relationship. So I think that the way that Aboriginal people can be diverted from justice is possibly different and hasn't been considered by wider Australia. It's different to the way that a non-Indigenous person would deal with the justice system. So I don't think that it's ever been looked at that there are different options to deal with people's offending, their recidivism and their recovery from substance abuse, from alcohol abuse, from all the issues that affect us in our communities. And if you look at a lot of the issues that bring people into contact with the justice system, with the police, they're poverty-based, you know, so... Do you want me to expand further, or?
Yes, please. I'm just thinking it through. I was just about to ask you a question of something like, how do we empower how do we support the community to deal with those underlying issues of poverty, which then lead into this, which then have this criminogenic effect?
Well, that goes back to opportunity and employment in communities, doesn't it? So how do you deal with poverty in any community? It's education, empowerment, jobs, opportunity. I think that's the baseline, and it's education in both senses, in contemporary westernised education and an education within your own culture, which is vitally important, because I know myself, I'm a very light-skinned Aboriginal man, but I'm very proud of my Aranda heritage, and my father's brought me up to be proud of his heritage, my mother's brought me up to be proud of her heritage. And my father ensured that I was educated in a contemporary westernised sense, and my mother made sure that I was educated through Aotearoa and my Aranda side of my family. So it enables me as a person to be balanced in my life, and it's why I'm able to somewhat successfully move between the two worlds. So an education... to support our children, to educate them within their own culture and to educate them to move and have employment opportunities and a future within wider society is what I think would be the best way forward, and it's what I'd encourage my own family members. But the way that we deal with children who are at risk, that are committing offences, that are coming into contact with police and the judicial system, perhaps looking at options to have community-based funded processes on their own country, led by their own communities, by their own leaders, in conjunction with existing process, might be the way forward. I mean, we've tried a lot of things in the Northern Territory. and we haven't found an option yet, so I think we need to keep trying.
I've got two more topics for you, Senior Constable. One is, following from your evidence on the last occasion, there was an article in the Centralian, I think, is that right? That you'll probably remember it, but there was an article that suggested that you face daily racism in the police force, and that was not what I heard you say on the last occasion. Did you read that article?
Yeah, I did. I was quite disappointed by the headline in the Centralian Advocate. I think if anybody reads a transcript of the last time I was in this court to give evidence, I made it quite clear that when I first joined the police, I saw racism almost daily in the workplace, and that's changed. That's changed since that period of time.
And in terms of what you do experience in the Northern Territory Police Force, can you tell us about what your experience is now in terms of working alongside police officers who care about some of the issues you've talked about this morning?
Like I said the last time I was in court, I was surprised when I joined the Northern Territory Police and I came back home to Alice Springs at the lack of racism that I saw in the workplace. I would be honest in saying that I haven't been subjected to, or I haven't seen overt racism in my workplace since I've been here since 2020. I've worked in several remote communities, and I've worked with a bulk of officers from general duties through to my current portfolio in crime, and it's not something that impacts me in the workplace. I'm very close with our Aboriginal Liaison Officer unit, with a lot of our Aboriginal community police officers and our Aboriginal constables, and we talk about it quite regularly, and we're an important part of this workplace. We're well supported, and I don't think I'd be backwards in saying that the bulk of people that I work with are here for the benefit of the community, irrelevant of their ethnic or racial or religious background.
And you gave evidence on the last occasion, I won't show you them again, but the text messages that were found on the phone of Constable Rolfe, you were shocked at the racist language used there.
Absolutely. I think all of the Aboriginal members that I know, we spoke about those text messages, and I don't think there was one of us that wasn't shocked, because we certainly don't hear that type of language used in the workplace day to day.
It's a passion of yours, I take it, to attract Aboriginal people into the workforce in the Northern Territory Police?
Absolutely. I think it's important for Northern Territory Police, or for any police service in Australia, to represent the community that they police. So, dependent upon the variance in ethnic makeup of the community you're working in, it depends on what target group you're going to attempt to attract to your organisation.
But do you agree that it's important, if you're going to attract Aboriginal people into the workforce, they need to feel culturally safe within the workforce they're in?
Absolutely.
And important for the Northern Territory Police to keep listening about how that feels and how to achieve it?
Yeah, I think my limited experience with Northern Territory Police is only, like I said before, it's only the 2 years in my prior time working in conjunction with them as a special connie of the AFP. But the NT Police, they're trying, and they're trying to make things better. I mean, when I look at the numbers, and I know when I was here with Sergeant Matthew Allen, we actually looked at the numbers of Aboriginal police officers we've got, and our sworn constables of Northern Territory Police, I think at that point in time, was 176. Our Aboriginal community police officers were sitting somewhere around, I think it was 66 from memory. Our Aboriginal liaison officers, I believe we had 40 within the Community Resilience Engagement Command, and that's growing. So, and don't quote me too heavily, but I believe we crunched the numbers and it came up that we were sitting at about 14.5% of the policing service identify as Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander. And I would endeavour to say that if you looked at the Northern Territory Police 20 years ago, those numbers would be very different. And I know that it's a priority for the Northern Territory Police moving forward to grow those numbers, to develop members and to provide a greater representation to police the Northern Territory community.
Senior Constable, last topic I've got for you involves, finishing on a positive note for me, the Marwell ROM program that you did, and you got your masters through Marwell ROM. Can you tell Her Honour about that?
So Marwell ROM was it was a master's degree that was done in conjunction with Charles Darwin University, set up by the Marwell ROM Foundation, which was conceptualised by Reverend Janini Gondara, or Reverend Dr. Janini Gondara, and Pat McIntyre, who was a barrister in Darwin, I believe. So it was a meeting place. It was based around cross-cultural mediation, and it was a meeting between westernised system of education and law and Madian system of law, which is Yolngu. It was held predominantly on Elcho Island. It was attended by police officers, judges, social workers, Aboriginal people, people from Elcho Island, people from Yuendamu, people from Largemanu. It was a fantastic process and program that certainly broached those cross-cultural issues that we deal with day to day. And through the process of that master degree, some of your learning space was in contemporary Western education based, and some of it was in Aboriginal education based through ceremony and through attendance. So
that program, I think, lost fund, or it's not fully funded at the moment. Is that right?
I actually don't know where it's sitting at the moment. I know there's a core group that is still trying to push that forward, and I know that they've got some stuff going on in Darwin at the moment, but I'm not involved with that because I'm in Alice Springs. So
there is a Marwell ROM working group. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And you were mentioning Jared Sharp's role in that, who's a former Najar lawyer, who then is one of the members on that working group. Is that right? Thinking of names that we can go to try and learn more about that.
I believe Jared is in Tasmania at the moment. I did the bulk of my master degree with Jared, but he would definitely be a good contact. Or Justine Davis, I think she's a driver for that group out of Darwin.
We can follow that up, Senior Constable, in terms of educating Cardia about the importance of customary law and the ways that we can work respectfully with Yapa. Would that be a good thing to have available to lawmakers through in the Northern Territory?
I think if we're going to move forward as a society, so not as Aboriginal people, not as non-Aboriginal people, but if we're going to move forward as a society, then somewhere along the line we need to address the idea that we've got multi-systems of law and combine and drive it forward as one nation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honour. Senior Constable, my name is Andrew Bowe. I appear for the Walker, Lane and Robertson families in this inquest. Do you understand that the Walkers and Lanes have a biological connection to Kumanjayi, and the Robertsons have taken on a familial role because of his relationship with their granddaughter Rakisha? Okay. Now, I wasn't here for your evidence on the last occasion, but I did watch it contemporaneously, and I have read your materials. Now, just say that my first regret is I did not know of all the things that you were speaking about before I came up to be involved in this case, because I've learnt quite a bit from the things you've said already. There are some questions that I want to go to specifically, and I'm not for the moment holding you up as the poster person for Indigenous Territorians. I understand all the caveats that you've put, and I respect the way in which you've been careful about delineating what you can say and cannot say. The focus of the the questions that I am going to get to, and it may take a little bit to get there so you've got the right context, is not so much the cultural, the acquisition of cultural knowledge by police, but really the application of that in their direct policing actions. And I'm going to focus attention on the things that have arisen in this case that what we can see, or certainly I can see at the moment, might be things that should be changed or at least acknowledged at first before we move on. They're big topics, I know, and Dr. Dwyer has taken us through that. I understand that, but I want to get to the issues that seem to have been associated with decisions by command in the setup of policing in Yuendamu, and then specific decisions in terms of the deployment of police to Yuendamu in and around the 6th and 9th of November. Is there any questions about that? So you understand where I'm coming from as to the direction? Thank you.
I understand where you're coming from.
Thank you. One of the matters that has risen for attention is how and in what way police take into account knowledge of sorry business in terms of making operational decisions. Okay? Now, the word sorry business is obviously an English word, and it's certainly used by a lot of Walpurgis people that I've spoken to. To the extent that in all of the documents that you may have been shown of what the Northern Territory Police have in place in a formal sense, also as to what you've experienced when you went to the recruitment programs in 2020 and 2022, what, if any, information do you believe has been given, firstly, to recruits about what, if anything, they should do to take into account their knowledge of sorry business when embarking upon an interaction with a member of the community?
You can't gain a lifetime. You can't gain a lifetime of knowledge in a few hours in a classroom or in a few days in a classroom. So, learning about Aboriginal culture and law is a process of immersion. How do we get that across to our police officers? Well, now Sergeant Matthew Allen would have been a better person to sit on the stand to talk about the process that's happening at the college in Darwin, because I don't work at the college in Darwin.
I did hear his evidence when he explained those matters, yes.
Yeah, but this is probably a more focused question at him because he's involved with the training of recruits in Darwin. I do cultural sessions with recruits from time to time when I'm available to attend. Sergeant Allen has set up a program that is being developed and being expanded. So I think NT Police is trying their best to give our members enough knowledge to be able to operate in communities. It's difficult.
Yeah, I'm not critiquing whether it's good or bad. I was trying to identify at the moment what, if anything, is being taught to members, whether in the recruit stage.
Well, which process of ceremony are you talking about? I know you're talking distinctly about sorry business, but it's such a big subject to address.
I agree entirely, and I wasn't going to go through all the matters that we've been putting to other witnesses. I was jumping really to this point.
I think that best practice would be to utilise the availability of Aboriginal liaison officers in communities, Aboriginal community police officers and Aboriginal constables. As I said previously, we've got quite a number in the organisation now. We're a resource that's able to be drawn upon by members within the organisation, and I think that I wasn't a member of the organisation when this incident happened at Yuendamu, but in the time that I've been in the organisation, certainly there's been a shift or a change in members seeking out knowledge in relation to how best to deal with situations in communities.
I understand. I've just been too imprecise in what I was driving at.
Yeah.
Could I suggest this? From your wealth of knowledge, it's clear, even though practices are different in different communities and even appreciation and practice within communities is different between members and members. I'm acknowledging all that. Is there not a starting point that that police are aware that the issue of sorry business in the community they are policing is a matter for them to take steps to acquire an adequate knowledge about, just as a starting point, and that would be achieved at two levels, if I may suggest. One is that at the recruitment level, that they are aware that this is an issue, and at an induction level, when they go into the community, that there be either accumulated information or a process of who to speak to acquire the specific knowledge, to take that factor into account when they're undertaking their police duties.
I think that is what is being done in our communities by our police officers. Actually, I don't think I know that that's what's being done in our communities in my experience and from what I've seen. Is there a base level? It's the recruits and our members, depending on when they join the organisation, would be exposed to and given information on the basis of when they joined. Is it better now than what it would have been in the past? I would endeavour to say yes.
But you would also accept that this sort of knowledge wasn't applied in November 2019.
I wasn't there when that happened.
I apologise for interrupting my learned friend, but in my respectful submission, while Senior Dollars is giving very impressive, if I may say, and reflective evidence, he ought not be asked to commentate on the events of 9 November 2019. He was not a sworn constable of the Northern Territory Police Force at that time. He's given that evidence. Commentary has already been given and it is expected will be given by a far more senior member of the organisation. It's not fair to put this witness in a position, if I may say, to have to commentate on those specific factual matters which have already been the subject of significant evidence.
Mr. Bowe, I don't think this witness has all the information about exactly what occurred at that time.
I wasn't going to go.
Provide any assistance with anything.
I understand that, but you know, there's a danger, if I may say, that answers that have been elicited from this witness may be used for general submissions that a lot has changed, everything's okay now, we're working on it, etc. My question, and I was responding to the answer the witness gave, and I'm not being critical at all of the witness, that he believed that this sort of approach was happening now. And I was
That's his belief now, and he's not able to comment on precisely to what extent that occurred back on the relevant day.
I understand the distinction, and I'll try to be more careful. The only document we have, for example, that I've been given, or at least I've read, as to the current formal documents in the Northern Territory Police Force is part of a document called Policing Between Cultures, and I'm told that it's a version that was in place on 11 May 2016, and I haven't been shown any further update of that document. Now, I haven't seen, for example, the information given at the recruitment stage, for example, Senior Constable, and the document I have has one page, which is page 56 of 101, which has a passing reference, if I may say, to the word sorry business. Now, what I was interested in, and I did listen to one of your sessions that you did in Alice Springs in 2020 this morning, and it was such an engaging session, but I didn't see in it any assistance being given to them, for example, on how to be mindful of the breadth and complexity of sorry business and the difference in particular communities and the difference in urban centres as opposed to places like Yundamu, as to how it might help them to go about policing.
I don't want to cut you off with this question, but once again, I don't work at the college. I'm a senior constable that works in the domestic family violence unit and sex crimes. I provide assistance to the college, and I've provided some sessions in relation to culturally appropriate actions on communities, cultural brokerage, cultural networking, and my experience from my own background and heritage. I think if you want to ask questions in relation to policy and what's being delivered at the college, then perhaps Sergeant Matthew Allen should have been back here with me, because together we could probably provide you with the answer you're seeking.
No, I understand that. Can I just go to the answers that you gave concerning, or the information that you gave concerning the English phrase payback, or English word payback. And you said two things I wanted to ask a little bit more questions about.
Yeah.
You spoke about the fact that your experience was that police officers, or non-Indigenous people generally, introduced into that term the notion of revenge as opposed to peacemaking, as you put it.
Yeah.
I think 2 days ago, I think we heard from one of the elders in Yundamu, Eddie Robertson, speak quite passionately about this issue and this problem. Did you happen to come across a recent program called The Australian Wars by Rachel Perkins? Do you happen to come across that?
No.
There was one reference in it which was a learning experience for me, where it was described that Governor Phillip received some payback from Bennelong after having been treated quite badly by the government in how they were treating him at that time. And it struck me, and I thought I'd like to hear your comment, that when you talked about society not embracing Indigenous cultural matters, but there is a history in this country going back nearly more than 200 years where that has been recognised and accepted. Does it surprise you that Phillip, if the story is right, accepted payback from Bennelong?
I'm not aware of that situation, and before I comment on it, I would like to be given the opportunity to understand the situation and contextualise it.
Sure.
And see exactly what happened.
Yeah. What I was going to was something Mr. Robertson spoke about, that one of the fundamentals of the notion of peacemaking or making justice about a situation is that following a recognition of the act by the person, that the family would identify an appropriate person to carefully deliver the payback, if I'll use that term, so as to ensure that the person who received it may have a memory or a mark about what they had done, but then they were free to move within the community because the whole community, peace had been made on the situation. Is that your sense of the importance of that within the community?
Yeah, I think that contextually it's a very complex matter, but I would say on a very basic level, that's where it's at.
Yes.
Yep.
And would you have heard the usage of the concern for payback by police because of a fear that Walpri or Indigenous people would do because of something police had done in the community? Have you used that? Have you heard the word payback being used for decision making by police?
Not in my experience, no.
No. If I can just tell you, if you accept it from me and others will correct, that word was used at 2 or 3 points on the 9th of November.
Once again, I wasn't part of
put it-
this organisation on the 9th of November 2019.
Surely I can put to the witness.
I'll just listen to the question. It may be that you are not able to answer it, but I'll just hear what the question is.
At the point when Kumanjayi was shot, he was in need of medical treatment. I think everybody accepts that, three shots in the back. But a decision was made by the members at the House that they feared payback, and therefore that's why they didn't stay there and then in order to perform the necessary medical treatment if it had been available. Do you understand?
I understand.
And the second time is that whilst the police were in the station, there were concerns that if information came out that Kumanjayi had passed, that would cause the community to violently descend upon the station as a form of payback. Do you understand?
I understand.
What I'm getting to is that, do you think that there is a real need for detailed, if not anthropologically supported information being explained to police who are making these decisions so they don't mistakenly grab onto something they may have interpreted as being a cultural action in the policing decisions they made, because doing so has caused great distress to our clients and our families in hearing this evidence that they weren't being told certain things because of a fear of payback, for example.
I haven't looked in depth at everything that happened in Yuendamu on the 9th of November 2019. My understanding of that situation is limited to what my exposure to it has been. Different police officers will make different decisions based upon their experience working within communities and within different communities and cultures, as I think most people's would be. If you're asking me for comment about whether they were right or wrong.
No, I'm asking you whether or not accepting different knowledge comes from different experiences, that where we have such critical decisions being made affecting Kumanjayi and his family, that knowledge should be improved. One of the decision makers here...
I don't think that there's anybody within the police service that would argue that we don't have to improve our knowledge and understanding of the communities we're policing. That's one of the reasons why I've been doing the sessions I've been doing at the college, and one of the reasons why Sergeant Matthew Allen is expanding and further developing the cultural component of our training package.
Understand.
And part of that would include a better understanding of the concepts that Mr. Bowe has been talking about, such as sorry business or payback, so that those words are not used in a culturally inaccurate or inappropriate way.
Yeah, 100%. I think that our police officers, especially our younger police officers, quite often come from interstate. They quite often have limited exposure, experience or knowledge of the communities they're working in, as would most people. And their knowledge is going to be expanded by living, working and being a part of the communities that they're policing.
Learning in the accurate, complete way, rather than just simply what they may have heard. Would you agree with that?
I would agree 100%.
Her Honour framed that question much better than I, and that really was what I was trying to get to. The reason I raise it is that one of the people who held that sort of perception about payback was a superintendent, and he was a decision maker, and that's why I raise it as a concern, that it's not so much the intent of the force to take steps, but it's in fact the practicality of making sure that that insight is reflected in operational decisions. Do you understand?
Which superintendent are you referring to? Yeah. So I'm not trying to sidestep your question at all.
I haven't felt that, can I just say it?
It would be probably a question better posed to Superintendent Knobs.
It was.
Yep.
And one of the difficulties with his answers from my part and from my client's part is that whilst he acknowledged all those matters, if I may say, the submissions we'll be making are that he didn't have a proper insight, and more so, he ended his evidence in saying, despite all the regrets, he would still do the same thing again. So that cuts to the point of what...
I think it does. I think his evidence was that, taking into account all the information available to him and his experience and the experience of other police in communities, he would still make the same decision. But I think your issue is slightly different, Mr. Bowe. It's attributing that the concerns of the police about their safety to the concept of payback. Whereas, as I understand it, that is an incorrect use of the term. If there were concerns about safety, it wasn't because of a concept of payback, it would be because of a concept of anger, immediate retribution or something like that, which is different from the cultural concept of payback. And it's using those concepts and melding those concepts in a way that people who, including me, may I say, without the greater understanding that we've been learning during the course of this inquest, with the term payback, that has caused a lot of upset and within the community, as I understand it.
There's nothing in that summary with which I disagree. I have spent some time looking at Superintendent Nobbs' evidence, and hopefully my submission will be more sophisticated than what I just put to the witness. I was just summarising that the notion that fed into the concerns about what the community would do outside was informed, at least in part, about a misappreciation of what Walbury people would do if they were in fact resorting to notions of payback in their response to being told.
I understand what you're saying,
Yeah,
Mr. Bowe.
yeah.
I certainly think that came out in the evidence.
It did, yes.
And I think the issue is, yes, this misunderstanding
Yes.
of what might be encompassed by payback.
If I may say, that's at the heart of a lot of the things that have happened as we've developed in understanding things and questions. I've mistakenly used terms myself until I've had a better understanding, and last week was very informative for us, not so much in the sessions, but us taking instruction to what concerned them about the way those things are done. Hence why I asked the question that, and Your Honour asked it, and I don't need to ask it again, that there was 100% acknowledgement that there needs to be a much more comprehensive insight of these important cultural issues in implementing decisions. So, but I'll move on.
I don't think ignorance or lack of understanding of Aboriginal culture and law is only an issue for the police.
I absolutely agree. I think most of the legal profession suffer as much with respect at all levels. And that's why, if I may say, there are lots of programs in which judges are going into communities and lawyers are going, to assist their own understanding of the clients they're acting for. So we're not in disagreement at all. And I heard very clearly that you believe that the knowledge and insight of the members of the Northern Territory Police Force align with the knowledge of the Australian community.
Yeah, which is limited.
Yeah. Yes, but the reason for the focus on your answers is because the Northern Territory has a particular ratio of interaction between police and Indigenous people, for
That's
whatever
correct.
reason, whatever reason. Which I might just jump to one thing that you said earlier on that issue. I heard from you say a couple of times that as a sworn police officer, your duty is to implement the law and undertake actions as to non-compliance with the law. They're my words. You've said it a couple of times.
To enforce legislation, yes.
And the second thing you said is that police members in the Territory, faced with the horrendous task of being at the front line of social dysfunction, alcoholism, etc., they are asked to do much more than people believe they are doing.
Yep.
What I want to ask you about that is that how might the Northern Territory Police Force act on that evidence in looking at the profile of people who come into the police force? And I just expand the question a little bit. It's clear that there are people who apply for recruitment because they have a genuine curiosity about the Indigenous world in the Territory and are genuinely wanting to be involved. And there are many people who, outside of police, do that: social workers, psychologists, doctors, judges, etc. If we know that your job is particularly hard because of these other things they need to know, do you think there needs to be a change of thinking in the idea of what policing in the Territory actually means? I'll put it this way. I'm a poor scholar of history, but I accept that when white laws are being brought into Indigenous communities, part of it is to bring laws that may not necessarily align with how people have been living before they came. Okay? So the policing of those laws is focused upon the community's adherence to the expectations that those laws provide. Okay? For example, you can't swear in public, and if you do, we're going to arrest you. For example, that sort of line of thinking, where that level of sensibility may not be something that greatly affected the way in which society operated before these laws came in. Okay, so is there a value with people with your knowledge sitting down with those who conceive what should be in recruitment programs, not just be there to deliver it, but what should be part of the criteria?
I think that sounds more like a bill that should be introduced to Parliament to change the legislation for the way that police enforce legislation. The role of a police officer is prescribed by the legislation that's applicable to the circumstance that they're in. If there was legislation that recognised cultural law, then police officers would be able to defer and use discretion and utilise that legislation. At this point in time, there is nothing applicable in place in this nation that allows us as police officers to make that consideration. I do in my role, based upon my understanding and knowledge that I've gained through my life. However, at times I could be criticised for taking that path, and I've had to justify my actions.
If I may say, sorry.
Discretion's a great part of policing. I've seen discretionary powers utilised a lot by members of the Northern Territory Police over the last 2 years. But I think, in answer to your question, that is something that needs to be handled on both a territory and federal government level if there's going to be change. And do I think there should be? Absolutely.
And do you think there might be some value in doing something close to what Dr. Wire put to you about the involvement of Northern Territory Health, is that there's collaboration at the pointy end of interaction, that going with police who are arresting are people who are very, very aware of what the issues are facing the arrestee, so that there can be more diversion from taking into detention or consideration of how to plan around at that point. That is not you ringing out somebody can find a place for somebody, or a lawyer ringing out, finding out is there a bail address. But part of the engagement, given that 96% of the engagement is with Indigenous people, likely to be suffering from a whole range of impairments, whether they're physical, mental or social or financial, that there be collaboration in the way in which the government agencies confront these situations.
In a perfect world, absolutely. Do I think the police are utilised in circumstances that are more appropriate for health or for education or for territory families? Absolutely. I think police are used as the stopgap.
Sorry, I just missed it because my colleague's dying. You should go outside.
I missed it as well. I think police are used as a stopgap in a lot of circumstances, not only in the Northern Territory but in wider society, to deal with people that there is no other option for. In a perfect world, when dealing with a mental health intervention, it would be best practice to have a mental health practitioner on site with you. But that mental health practitioner would have to take into account their personal safety. Police officers are trained to a level. We wear protective equipment. We are used to dealing with people that are in crisis at that front line space that could result in a level of violence that could require an intervention. To find a public servant that would be willing, or a government department that would be willing to place somebody there with us all the time, that might be the challenge.
You've identified the challenge, and I guess others. How do we start that conversation with those who make these decisions about the allocation of resources?
Once again, I'm a senior constable working for the Northern Territory Police. I think that that's a conversation that's well above my pay level and probably best placed with government.
Yes. I don't think any government members are going to be brought before this court, but do you think the starting point of having that conversation, recognise those challenges that you've just identified, is perhaps the Commissioner's representative when he gives evidence?
Yeah, perhaps best addressed towards the Commissioner's representative, or perhaps it is appropriate for a member of our current serving government to address this court with what they think the direction should be going forwards.
I think part of the process here is that we're expected to assist Her Honour to make findings, and Her Honour will make whatever recommendations to government that is thought appropriate. But I accept that we don't have information of what their views are on these matters, other than perhaps by statute they're willing to take recommendations. As you know, recommendations are just that; they don't have to be implemented. Just two or three other specific issues. We've heard in this court referenced by police officers in the utilisation or non-utilisation of ACPOs with using terms like poisoned cousin or avoidance relationships. Now, are you familiar with those terms, albeit in other language groups?
Are you referring to the difficulties that Aboriginal police officers have dealing with their own communities?
No, one of my clients is ACPO Williams.
Yes.
So I've had quite a lot of conversations with him about how he has been treated and utilised, etc. And they will be a number of submissions we make. What I was more interested in is this. Is the concepts of poison cousins and avoidance relationships a matter within the conversations that you're having when you have your sessions, or are you aware of it's part of the concerns in the recruitment and training of ACPOs?
Well, dependent upon somebody's level of cultural involvement, would depend on what the restrictions are in relation to what you describe as poison cousins or avoidance relationships. So, with somebody like Mr. Williams, yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult for me. I've got a community west of Alice Springs that it's extremely difficult for me to operate and work in for cultural reasons.
The angle I was getting at was not so much that. I've heard your evidence about that.
Yep.
The angle was the misconceptions that non-ACPO police officers had about why they may not utilise somebody because of their perception, we say mistaken.
So you're asking me to talk about individual police officers' perceptions of cultural understanding, is that correct?
No, I'm asking you to talk about whether you're aware that police are assisted to know what those relationships are and not to have a mistaken view of why they may inhibit an ACPO being involved.
So you're speaking directly to the circumstances of Mr. Williams' involvement with the incident at Yuendamu, is that correct? Yep.
Yeah, I don't know that this witness can properly be expected to comment on that.
I'm not going to ask about what happened on that day. I'm going to use it as an example where a police officer decided that an ACPO should not be used because of a misconception about the concept of poison cousin or avoidance relationship without having spoken to them.
Well, it would probably been beneficial at the time for that constable to have a conversation with that Aboriginal community police officer and discuss what was viable in the circumstances culturally and what wasn't.
Thank you.
Which
That's
is
what,
how
yeah.
I deal with situations.
Yes.
If I'm asked to deal with, I've got family covering most of the Central Desert region. I work in a very targeted area that deals with specific crime types.
Yes.
If I have a conflict of interest or a cultural obligation issue that arises in relation to my role, then I advise my team and my supervisor of those issues and I educate them around that.
Thank you. But you've got the strength of position of being a non-ACPO police officer, don't you? Mate? You're in a better position to have to articulate that. Do you agree that it really falls upon the officer in charge or the forward commander in any particular community to make sure that they are aware and the members underneath them are aware what limitations, if any, in fact exist for the utilisation of an ACPO that may have connection to the community?
No, I disagree. I believe it falls directly to the person performing the functions as an ACPO or a police officer to educate and advise those that they're working with in relation to how they can best assist to perform functions in that community.
I understand. Is that part of the training of ACPOs that they have that responsibility?
Once again, you would have to ask that question to Sergeant Matthew Allen, who works at the NTP FES College.
You spoke a lot about a real appreciation, both from a personal level and your observations and your tertiary education, etc., about the need for all Australians, in particular police, to recognise generational trauma in the communities that they are servicing in some areas. Right? For example, to have a real knowledge, not just a historical Wikipedia entry about constant massacre, for example, for Yuendamu people. It's a huge task, isn't it, to get somebody else to recognise somebody else's trauma about which they have no experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The sentiment that came from the engagement earlier this week, and certainly from my brief time engaging, is that the constant massacre process was resolved, was completely satisfactory to them. To this day they are hurt by that. There's evidence from last week, or earlier this week, that what's happened so far in respect of Constable Rolfe's actions is far from satisfactory, to use a neutral word, for many of the family and many of the community. Is it really an issue that can never be addressed? Because it's taken 70 odd years now, and it still hangs over, or 90 odd years now, it still hangs over the heads of this community in Yuendamu, and all this has done is triggered their sense of how they would be treated.
I think that could be said for every person of Aboriginal heritage within the nation of Australia who have had family members that have died at the hands of police. My family's interaction with the police hasn't always been positive. My interaction with the police as a young person wasn't always positive. So the only way that we can try and drive that forward is through education and understanding. It's a difficult concept. I mean, people do entire university theses on the subject that you've just asked me about in relation to intergenerational trauma. How do you understand how somebody else feels about a given situation that you're not involved with? That's effectively what you're asking,
Yes.
correct?
And I put it in this way because in lots of conversations I've certainly had, both at the bar table and with witnesses, the proposition is put back to me when I argue one way, that it's a two-way responsibility. There's no good coming up with recommendations of how we, the police, should be if they're not going to do something about their problems or how they, quote, behave. And with respect, I mean, I find that an offensive concept, you know, the idea that the traumatised community somehow got to repeatedly own their trauma and tell police to please take that into account when you're dealing with this. So that's what I wanted to get to.
Yep, but I understand what you're saying, but working in our communities is exceptionally difficult and exceptionally challenging. It can be extremely violent, and in some way or fashion, I could describe it as at times brutal. So when you're going to, as a police officer, when I'm going to a job that involves high levels of violence, it's difficult for me to take everything into account in the matter of minutes, seconds that I have to prepare myself to deal with that situation. So it's what you're asking me is an exceptionally difficult question. And how I would deal with something would be totally different to how another constable would deal with something, because it's based upon my contextualised understanding of intergenerational trauma and its effects on the community. And the conversations that I can have with people in the community are different to conversations that other people can. I guess this is where the importance of having a representation of the community within our ranks is highly beneficial, because that's the only real way that you're going to get an appreciation within any government organisation of the way that the communities feel about the process of colonisation, which is what you're talking about, and how to drive that forwards and how to effectively deal with issues within the community.
May I take from your answer, and can I just illustrate in this way, one of the most powerful pieces of evidence I heard from Derek Williams was that on occasions he had to sit down with Kumanjayi for up to 40 minutes to explain to him again, because he'd done it previously, why he was being arrested, what would happen to him, and that he would be safe if he came with him to be arrested. Now, that involves, from Derek's point of view, the fact that he knew Kumanjayi.
Yep.
Right? And the fact that he, Derek, was wanting to conduct himself whilst walking in two worlds, do the job, but do the job in a way that is safe for both of them to take Kumanjayi in. Now that, if I may say, example should in fact be what all police hope to achieve, that is, have sufficient knowledge of who they are going to arrest in order to plan in a way that's safest for both of them.
Well, I'll put it to you this way. If I'm working in Sydney as an Aboriginal police officer, which I've done, and I've got an arrest target that comes from Lakemba, and that arrest target is of a different faith culture to me, speaks English as a second or third language, is highly volatile, I'm not going to have the knowledge base to deal with that person. This is what our police officers face day to day when they're dealing with people in communities in the Northern Territory. So, Senior ACPO Williams, Mr. Williams, has an amazing understanding of his own community and his own culture. It's taken him a lifetime to gain that. No police officer, through any course, any guidance that we give them, is ever going to be able to match the experience and the knowledge base that he has within his own community.
But what they can do is make sure when it's possible, he's the frontline contact with people in the community in these non-urgent circumstances.
In non-urgent circumstances, and I think that that's best practice within remote communities, but not every remote community has a Aboriginal community police officer or an Aboriginal liaison officer. I think that there's definitely drive to have that in effect, but it's not in place at the moment.
I guess as I sit down, that goes to your question that these sorts of resource allocation are matters for senior command and government because it's not so much how much money goes to the police force, it's how the police force decides to allocate resources to making sure that there are in fact available ACPOs and ALOs and Indigenous senior sergeants and officers in charge within the Northern Territory.
Yeah, in a perfect world moving forward, there's definitely room for expansion there. And I know through conversations that I've had with senior members of our organisation, I can definitely see and I understand that that's the process that's being attempted.
I understand. You may not wish to answer this question. Do you prefer to be discharging your duties at the level that you're doing, that is in being in charge of a patrol group or the crime division that you're in, or would you think that you would be better placed to be advising senior command about how the whole force should operate in terms of being critically involved, directly involved in formulating the matters that we're talking about?
I think that there's space for both. I'm an individual, but there's many of me within the Northern Territory Police. I'm certainly not unique in any fashion.
But are any of you, do you have the ear at an operational rank level with the Commissioner?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Do you think that would be a really useful usage of your collective and individual insight and skills?
Do I think that there should be a development pathway for Aboriginal people within the Northern Territory Police? 100%.
More than that, if we don't, like with the judiciary, when we didn't have Indigenous judges, they were hoping to learn from their experiences. Once we've got Indigenous judges, people are talking collegiately, collaboratively, in a safe place about how to better be judges in relation to Indigenous matters, for example. It would be useful, wouldn't it? And not just having more Indigenous people there, but having Indigenous people part of the decision making of how allocation of resources are going.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with your sentiment.
Yeah. Right, thank you. I have no further questions.
Very convenient time for a break, please. We'll just take them morning and tea adjournment. There's a number of other people who will no doubt want to have some further questions of you.
All set? Temporarily.
I'll turn you around, Jerry wanted.